Another day, another Royal Rumble review. Today it's time to talk about the 1993 Royal Rumble. And the best way I can put it for this show is out of the 5 matches, you probably only really need to bother to go back and watch 3 of them. And one of those 3, unfortunately, is not the Royal Rumble match itself, which lets you know that this wasn't necessarily a very good pay-per-view. All right, so here's what you had. The opening tag match between the Steiner brothers and the Beverley brothers was really good. A good opening tag match, and this was kind of like the 3rd straight year where you had a really good tag match to kick off the Royal Rumble pay-per-view. It definitely fell into that category. I don't think it was nearly as good as the 91 match between the Rockers and the Orient Express, and probably a little bit under the new Hart Foundation versus the Orient Express in 92, but still a good tag match in its own way, and it's very funny to go back and look at the Steiner brothers back in 1993. Wow. Vintage, to borrow a phrase from Michael Cole, to say the very least. The next match is a personal favorite of mine. That's Shawn Michaels versus Marty Jannetty for the Intercontinental Championship. And this match here, other than the ending, which was a little bit disappointing, I thought the match was really damn good. And of course, this had a lot of story and history to it. Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty were tag team partners for years. And then we all remember what happened. We all know what happened when Shawn Michaels turned on Marty Jannetty in that famous, oh so famous barbershop segment. That was so well done and so hard-hitting and so dark. It was fucking awesome. And the feud between these 2 guys when they split off as a tag team was pretty awesome as well. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed this match for the most part, except, like I said, maybe the finish. One of the dud matches on this card, though, was Bam Bam Bigelow versus the Big Boss Man. Bam Bam defeated the Big Boss Man, and excuse me, I just really don't have a lot to say about it. One match I do have something to say about, though, is the WWF Championship match on this card. That's Bret Hart defending his title against newcomer Razor Ramon. And, this is what I'm talking about when you bring in somebody and you debut him in a big way. Razor Ramon was brought in with a series of vignettes. He was somebody different. It was a cool-ass character. And they immediately vaulted him into a main event spot, into the title shot, and sent him up against Bret Hart, who was trying to establish himself as a legit world champion for the future with this company. And this match here was really damn good. It's probably what you would expect out of Bret Hart and Razor Ramon. You go back and look at it, and you always sit there and say to yourself, man, you wish Scott Hall would have been able to keep his stuff together. Because if he would have been able to, he could have been a world champion at some point in time. And there is no question. There's no question he could have been. Whether it been in the WWF as Razor Ramon, that character was more than over enough to actually be world champion, or even if he would have went to WCW when he was just Scott Hall. At some point in time, you wish Scott Hall maybe would have gotten a run as a world champion because it would have worked because he was over enough to justify that position. Unfortunately, he couldn't be trusted. He wasn't clean. All these different things kind of played a role, which is a shame ultimately. Because, and even maybe you say in the mid-90s in the WWF, he slipped through the cracks a little bit, and that very well may be true. But it still is kind of sad and tragic, like I said, that Scott Hall, Razor Ramon, was never able to become WWF champion. And you really think about it, that seems to be a missed opportunity during this new generation phase from like 93 to 97. And, there are a lot of Scott Hall fans out there. And to me, this is a definite highlight of his career to be able to go out there with Bret Hart and put on a really, really damn good world title match. And to me, easily the match of the night on this card, no question about it. In some ways, maybe a little bit of a shame that it didn't main event the show. It didn't, and that's the way it works. The Royal Rumble match main evented on this show, but with the benefit of being able to go back in retrospect 21 years later, maybe deep down you wish Bret Hart and Razor Ramon would have. And then you get to the actual Royal Rumble match itself. And for the WWF, I don't want to crap on them too much at this point in time because we have to understand this was a roster undergoing a dramatic transformation and an amazingly huge transition. The Warriors were gone. The Hogans were pretty much gone in terms of an everyday basis. Yeah, he would appear at WrestleMania 9 for a little bit afterwards, but that was it. Hogan wasn't a day-to-day presence anymore. Savage, even though he was the last person to be eliminated in the Royal Rumble, he was kind of taking a back seat. This was a time where the roster was definitely undergoing some upheaval, some major changes, And it shows in the product when you go back and watch the pay-per-views of 1993. They're just not all that good, even if they were produced well, even if they were structured well. Just wasn't the same. It just wasn't the same. This was clearly the end of the Hogan era, and 93 was clearly the beginning of a few years of real transition and real, frankly, struggle for the WWF. Now, as far as the Royal Rumble match itself, I feel like it's very boring to go back and watch. It's one of those ones that you definitely don't have to watch. You definitely will want to skip. Maybe watch the last 10 minutes just so that way you could see how the finish plays out. Yokozuna winning the Royal Rumble was obviously the thing you had to do. It was the right decision. And this was the first year that the WWF officially went with the stipulation that the winner of the Royal Rumble got a world title shot at WrestleMania. So you were setting the table here between Bret Hart and Yokozuna at WrestleMania. So Yokozuna, the guy was almost 600 pounds. And I think it's important to talk about with Yokozuna, too, just how really good he was. He was really athletic for his size. He really knew what to do in the ring. He knew how to work with his size. And, it's impressive going back and watching Yokozuna work and watching some of his matches. You maybe forget sometimes through the scope of history just how good this guy really was, at least from an outside perspective looking in. Yokozuna was really damn good. I always find it funny that they marketed a Samoan as Japanese and made the Japanese Samoan a world champion. I always thought that was kind of funny. So when anybody ever says, when I talk about the WWE being racist towards black wrestlers when it comes to being WWE champion, they say, well, they're not kind to Asians. Well, that is true, but they technically took a Samoan, made him Japanese, because they assumed that nobody could tell the difference, and back then most people probably couldn't tell the difference anyways, and they made him a world champion. That's 1-0 on the count, because you can't count Rock, because even The Rock counts himself as Samoan. Either way. But like I said, at least you can say with the Royal Rumble match, even though I felt it was relatively boring itself, and it had some big name players in there, the Ric Flairs, the Mr. Bob Backlunds. That would be one of the highlights of this show to me, though, would also be that Bob Backlund was the one saving grace of this Rumble match to me, frankly. The fact that he set a new longevity record, entering in at number 2 and lasting to the final 3. That was big time stuff. The only other crock might have been that Mr. Bob Backlund didn't win the Royal Rumble. Him versus Bret Hart for the title would have been something to behold, too, at WrestleMania 9. It actually would have. So you had talent in there. Like I said, DiBiase was in there. Jerry the King Lawler was in there. Undertaker was in there. You had the notable, maybe not so notable, debut of Giant Gonzalez. Oof. Poor Undertaker. If any old school fan, or any fans, wonder why old school people like me have such tremendous respect for Undertaker and why we stubbornly stick to the claim that Taker's streak should never be broken and never be ended, and that he should always remain undefeated at WrestleMania. Keep in mind that this is the same Undertaker that once had to work a full program that carried through the summer of 93 with Giant Gonzalez. That type of shit right there. And Undertaker was in charge of trying to make it good. That's why fans like me have so much respect for The Undertaker. That's why fans like me refuse to accept that anybody should ever be able to break the streak. And that's just the way it is. So ultimately, like I said, the opening tag match for the 3rd straight year on a Royal Rumble show was pretty good. I liked the Shawn Michaels Marty Jannetty match, minus the finish. But again, the story leading into this type of match was really, really good. Bam Bam and Boss Man was a kind of a dud and a disappointment. Bret Hart versus Razor Ramon for the WWF Championship was the match of the night. And at least I could say, unless you want to argue Mr. Bob Backlund, which you definitely could do, that Yokozuna winning by last eliminating Randy Macho Man Savage was ultimately the right decision for the company. The WWF at the time, they loved featuring the big monsters, and it definitely didn't get any bigger or more monstrous than Yokozuna. Tomorrow, we're talking about the 1994 Royal Rumble. Do I have to talk about that Rumble match and that finish? Yeah, I guess I do. All right.